Well, Helen, thank you so much for coming to my podcast and joining us here.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
It's really interesting. I'm just reading your book right now. I'm like three quarters into it, and it's so interesting to read, and it's so also appalling sometimes to hear about these facts that we're going to go into later. But first, a little bit about you. I'm so interested in you as well as a person. Are you currently also a journalist at the Economist?
And no, I actually stepped down from my job at The Economist. I worked there 2005 to 2022. The year before I finished, I took an unpaid leave of absence to go and work with Sex Matters, which is a campaign group that campaigns for clarity about sex in public policy and in law. And I just decided at the end of that, this was too important for me. And with the editor's blessing, I decided not to go back. So it's very important that I say The Economist was always very supportive of me. And this is not at all one of those stories where a journalist was forced out for writing about this issue. I still love The Economist. I still feel very fondly towards it and stay in contact with everyone there. But no, now I work for a campaign group for part-time and then do various other things, including my own subscription newsletter the rest of the time.
Yeah, because I heard that the Economist is like one of the most rigorous newspaper when it comes to fact checking as well. Because I was recommended the Economist to read it from a friend who said that actually at the Economist is like every case that you present or that you publish has to go through almost like three different journalists, like for vetting and checking the facts, check again, double check, triple check. Is it like that at the Economist?
Oh, completely. Yeah.
Hmm.
So correspondence, which I was until 2014, I was a correspondent. You write your article, you file it to a section editor. Your section editor puts a lot more work into it than a copy editor would at another paper. It then goes through a specialized research department to be fact checked. And the fact checkers are told that they work for the paper, not for the journalist. So they come back with any and all queries they have. They confirm what they can, and then it's the section editor and the fact checker together who produces a version of the story that they're happy with. A lot of stories get legally checked as well, and then it goes up through another tier of editing to what we call the front and back half editors, who are the people who coordinate literally the front of the paper, which is the geographical regions, and the back of the paper, which is business, finance, and science. And then if it's a leader, it's also the editor involved. So it's at least three and sometimes four journalists plus a fact checker, and
So
sometimes legal as well.
So you're really used to being rather diligent and fact oriented when you're writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people said, why did I not have references in my book? And I mean, it's a mistake. I do have references in it. They're as end notes, but they're not marked with, 1, 2, 3 throughout.
Mhm.
And it's really, I mean, I said I worked as a correspondent until 2014, and then I became one of the section editors that other people filed to. So from 2014 till 2022, I was one of the people who had to produce several pages of the paper each week. And I just became very used to the idea that I didn't put things down unless I was sure of them.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I probably should have put in those references because other people don't know that that's
Yeah,
the way
yeah.
The Economist works and the way I
Mhm.
work. And of course, I should say that in something the length of a book, some errors did make it through. There
Yeah.
were a few small errors that I corrected in the second printing of the book, but nothing since then.
Mhm. But what made you want to be a journalist to start with? What got you into that? What is there some? What's your motivation to getting into journalism?
Well, it actually never occurred to me. I wasn't somebody who did the writing-y type things at university. I did a degree in mathematics. And I did a degree in maths, first degree in maths in Ireland, and then I did a master's, it's called Part 3, in Cambridge, and then I did my PhD in mathematics in London, University College London, and then I actually spent 3 years doing postdoc as well, so I thought I was going to be an academic, and I did not write one thing from when I was 17 and I'd left school until when I actually moved sideways from an academic mathematic position to what's called academic related at the University of Cambridge. And I worked for a project that encourages people to be interested in mathematics, like a public understanding of maths type job. And I started writing articles then that were intended for people at the end of their school career thinking about going on to do mathematics, interesting bits of maths. And then from there, I started working for the Royal Statistical Society, doing the same thing about statistics, writing for a more general audience about statistics. And I had been a subscriber to The Economist for many years at that point. My father had been one, and I had read it when I was still living at home. And then I saw an ad for a job, just a small ad saying, send us an article that you think would be suitable for publication in The Economist along with your CV. And I wasn't even job hunting at the time. I liked the jobs I was doing for Cambridge and the Royal Statistical Society. But I thought, well, maybe if I write them something about official statistics, actually the article I wrote was about errors in polling before elections, because this was just around the time of a general election in 2005. I thought maybe I could get some freelance work for them, just writing occasional pieces about official statistics or such like. And to my very great astonishment, they offered me the job of education correspondent. And that was one of those forks in the road. Like, I didn't in any way feel ready for that job. But it's the sort of chance that comes less than once in a lifetime. So I jumped and I took that job. And it was difficult for many reasons, not least that I had literally just got pregnant with my second child when I started that job. So it was very hard work. But I've loved The Economist ever since. It's a place where ideas matter, where a disagreement is encouraged, which still has not capitulated to the identitarianism that's become very common in most of journalism and that tries to be intellectually rigorous and fair in everything that it does and says. You don't necessarily have to agree with what we do and say, but you can see that it's good faith, I hope. And I think any of the readers can see that.
I guess that one thing that both mathematics and journalism has in common is the search for truth, where in mathematics you want to find what is true. And also, ideally, in journalism, you also want to dig and find what's true beneath it all.
I mean, only sort of. Like, that's a very highfalutin version of journalism. I mean, I found that I loved journalism, and I mean, I'd miss it, except that I am still doing some. I have a column in the Critic magazine. I do still feel jealous when I see people breaking big news stories because it's such fun. The news is such fun. I mean, what I loved about journalism and what I still love about it, for an academic, I have a short attention span. Like, I'd say I have a long attention span compared to many other people, but like an academic, doing the same thing for 40 years, no. Like, I did Brazil for 4 years when I lived there. I did education for about 4 years. I was always happy to move on. But journalism, like, what you're doing, like, at its best is the first draft of history, but often it's not that. And I often talk now to other people who are campaigning for sex-based rights like I am, and I give them little tutorials on what journalism's about, what journalists are looking for, how to talk to journalists, how to write a press release, how to pitch news, and so on. And what I say to them is, sometimes they get angry when a story goes in the paper or on a news channel and it quotes them, but then it also quotes people who disagree with them. And I'm like, no, it's all good. It's all good. Like, journalism has to be fast. It has to be on the news, and it uses heuristics to try to do a good job in a way that mathematics doesn't. So as a journalist, you see something like, a freedom of information request turns up that doctors are being trained to record people's gender identity rather than their sex. You might have 90 minutes to write this. If you're lucky, you have half a day. So you try to get comment from the person it's about, get comment from someone who agrees with it, someone who disagrees with it, try to draw some analogies, set it in a context to do with other things that are happening in politics, write it as clearly as you can, off it goes, on to the next thing. And so you're just getting things out the door. And I always really liked that. One of the things is, you're not trying to get to the truth necessarily. Like, you hope that over time it converges to the truth. But what you're doing is you're just trying to put stuff out there in good faith, explaining who everybody that you're talking to and about is, so that your readers can evaluate what they should make of what that person says. So, if you're talking about a financial firm, you're going to say whether the person you're talking to has an interest in it, or whether they're in the same industry, or whether they hold shares. And on our subject, the one that I write and talk about all the time, which is trans issues, you want to know, does this person have a trans identity? What sex are they? Are they a man who wants to compete in women's sports? Is this a parent who has transitioned their child? Is it someone with a training company that makes money out of this? And then just get the damn story out the door and write the next one. And I found that a very congenial and interesting thing to do. And I do miss it in a way because I love news.
But what made you want to write the book Trans When Ideology Meets Reality?
So that was the title that it was published under, and it's recently been re-released as Trans Gender Identity and the New Battle for Women's Rights, in case anyone sees it. I've only written one book. It's that book, the one that starts with the word trans. At the time, I discovered that there was even this ideology, because like I said, I studied mathematics. I didn't do sociology or gender studies or anything like that. I was completely ignorant of the fact that there were people who seriously thought that what made you a woman or a man was what you said you were. Like, I literally didn't think there was a single person in the world who believed that. I'd never heard of Judith Butler. You know, I was vaguely aware there were people who had some sort of operation that was called sex change operation, and I had not given it any thought. So that was 2017. And what it was a senior editor, actually the editor-in-chief of The Economist, just mentioned to me that she'd heard about this from her kids. And at the time, I was editing a section of the paper that's called the International section, and it runs a long read each week on something that crosses borders, and so doesn't fit very neatly into any of the sections in The Economist. And that was a very interesting job for me, because I commissioned people to write about like absolutely anything and everything. You know, trends in nuclear power, what's happening with NATO, the effect of pornography on teenagers' minds, trends in philanthropy, like just incredibly different things. So I thought this would be interesting. A little bit of Googling, I found that it was true, that there were loads more kids identifying as trans and lots of them were girls, which was not a phenomenon anyone had seen before. And I did think this is a bit odd. Like, why is this happening now? And, what does it mean to say trans women are women, which is the slogan? And at the time, the slogan was very much trans women are women, no debate. So I just got really interested in that. And then I was very intrigued by the way that the people I approached talked to me. They really made it clear that they thought that simply by trying to investigate this topic, I was bigoted. And I had never had that experience before as a journalist, not at all.
Why do you think that is? Just to jump in there, why did they conclude that right away?
Well, what I've since realized is that this is basically a neo-religion. It's a godless neo-religion, quite a cultish godless neo-religion, actually. And it's not, the people who believe it don't accept it that way. They don't see it that way. They see themselves as a civil rights movement. But if you look at and think about what they're saying, they're making a metaphysical claim about human beings that's very much like saying we all have a soul, we're all going to live in the afterlife. If you accept Jesus as your savior, you will be saved, and if you don't, you will go to hell. Like, it's that sort of claim. And if you look back through human history, people who believe these things are generally quite intolerant of people who don't. And it's been one of the great achievements of the modern era to tame religions so that religious people understand that they can believe what they like, but they can't impose that on others. And that's really central to the liberal settlement that we live within. Now we've got a neo-religion that's arisen, which says that everybody has a gender identity for which you can read a sexed soul. And that sexed soul, when you give it life by uttering it, is what makes you a man or a woman or something else in between, or neither, or fluid, or whatever. And everybody else has to go along with that, just like, the inquisitors didn't accept that other people didn't agree with their religious claims.
Yeah, they're with us or against us.
But because it's not accepted as a religion, we don't treat it like a religion.
Yeah.
We treat it like a civil rights movement. And so it's a hyper-intolerant religion that's not being tamed by being treated as a religion.
Yeah, rather
and
protected.
That's why they behave like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes it so difficult to criticize. Also, I think that one of the hallmarks of our Western society and civilization is the ability to be able to criticize anything, especially religions. And when you have certain parts of the society that is like, no, you can criticize everything, just not this, then it gets no corrections, then it gets no input. It's like having a world leader who never gets any input or feedback from other people. It just goes like one way and gets blindsided by that.
Yeah, absolutely. And with this one in particular, because it's so counterfactual, like it's trivially false that what makes you a man or a woman is this gender identity or this statement. Like, it's really obvious what makes you a man or a woman is the fact that human beings are mammals, and mammals come in two sexes, and those are evolved categories, and they evolved for the purposes of reproduction, and no mammal can change sex. So I've just demolished the whole thing in 2 or 3 sentences there. So it's like a particularly stupid counterfactual religion. Like, I mean, if you say that you believe that Jesus Christ died for our sins, I can't disprove that. But if you say that what makes you a man or a woman is what you say you are, that's trivially false. So it's such a particularly dumb religion, and you can't criticize it, which means that it's totally unmoored from reality. Like, if you think about Christianity, which is the religion, I mean, I was brought up Catholic, although I'm an atheist now. If you think about what Catholics believe, like, okay, at the center of it, there's this doctrine about Christ and the resurrection, but a lot of the rest of it is the teachings of Christ, which say how you live a good life. And those things are quite tethered to reality. Like, if you say something like the golden rule is a good way to organize society, people talk about that and think about it. And, you know, there's a connection with the way we organize the world, and people can say when you think it might be a good idea to break the golden rule, for example. But this has no connection with reality. It's just trivially false. It lives in its own bubble, and you can't talk about it. So it goes off into the wildest places, like just utterly like insane in grotesque and scary ways, like mutilating and sterilizing children in the name of it.
But why do you think people go? But why do people go along with that? Why do people accept that this is like one part of society that we can't criticize? Why? Is that because of peer pressure? Is it fear of speaking up? Is it because of cancellation culture? Is it amalgam of all this?
That just pushes the question along. That just pushes the question along to the next level. Like, why cancellation culture? Why this? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I think about that all the time, and really trying to answer that was why I wanted to write the book, because it's so puzzling that it actually made me lose sleep. I was constantly ruminating about it and thinking why this strange thing was happening. And the best answer I can give you is that, you know, not just our sex is evolved, but our cognition is evolved too. And we didn't evolve to be right. We evolved to survive and reproduce. And in the small tribal settings and small tribal groups that most of human history and prehistory have involved, you survive and reproduce by going along with your tribe. So independent-mindedness and accuracy about things that your tribe doesn't go along with are not actually very selected for in human history. So this has been, for basically kind of historical reasons, this ideology has been taken up very much by the American left, by the American Democratic Party. And America is a super tribal country politically. It's very polarized. So the Democratic Party was captured by organizations like the ACLU and the Human Rights Campaign and GLAAD, which are all civil rights organizations that did good work when they were founded, standing up for Black people's civil rights, for, you know, other people's free speech rights, for gay people. But they've become trans rights activist movements as those other causes have been, you know, partially won. We're never going to get rid of racism or homophobia, of course, but, you know, very great progress has been made. So those organizations captured the Democratic Party. And then if you're somebody who really dislikes the Republicans, as lots of Americans do, like it's often about who you don't like more than who you like. And I mean, there's a lot to dislike about the Republicans. So if you're the sort of person who's always been a lifelong Democrat, well, and you say you don't agree with this thing, you're casting yourself out of your tribe. And we're very good at what's called policy-based evidence making. So you've probably heard the expression in government or in civil service, evidence-based policy making, which means look at the evidence, make your policy on the basis of the evidence, try the policy out, keep checking how it's working. Actually, what humans are better at is the opposite, which is to start from what you want and then create the evidence to fit that. And, you know, we're meant to have all these institutions and checks and balances and regulators and scientific method and so on to stop us doing that. But it is what we're very good at. So people, if they know that they're going to be cut off by their intellectual tribe, they make sure they don't think the thoughts that might lead them down the chain of reasoning that gets them to a place where they would find they had to say something that would get them cast out. So, I mean, it helps for me that I'm politically very non-tribal or atribal. You know, I worked at The Economist where it was actively welcomed to say things that went against the consensus for a long time. But also, I've never been somebody who has at all identified with any political label. I have voted for every one of the three major political parties here in the UK in a general election. I've never been a member of a party. I'm not a contrarian. I'm not somebody who likes to believe the opposite of what people believe for the sake of it. But I would say that on the spectrum of how much you mind disagreeing with the people around you, I mind very little.
Mm-hmm.
So and also I'm just older, like this is a quite new ideology.
Yeah.
You know, anyone under 30 really finds it hard not to go along with this if they've been to university, because it's just absolutely pumped into all graduates at this point. But I mean, I'm in my 50s. So it just was obviously insane to me the first time I gave it a moment's thought. But yeah, generally speaking, although it's so insane, a lot of people have a strong incentive not to see the insanity. And I would say one more thing, which is that it's an interesting fact about religions, and even more so the very strange ones that we call cults. The odder they are, the more appealing they are, because it feels intriguing and special to believe obviously false and crazy things in a way that it doesn't to believe straightforward things.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of appeal of, you know, having access to forbidden knowledge, like being almost mystical.
Yes.
Like if you're the sort of person who can actually look at the man and see the woman, like, wow, you've attained a higher plane of consciousness. I think there's a bit of that going on too.
Yeah, like just thinking when you're saying this, I'm thinking about the word like trans. If you add the transcendental to that, it's perhaps there's something there, like to have a transcendental feeling about society. You want to elevate above everything and get away
elevate above
from
bodies.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the way that kids call people basic, like somebody's basic if they're not woke and if they don't understand, you know, like if you're too boring to understand the mystery that makes people male or female that's not their body.
Yeah, it's
like you
boring.
feel special.
Yeah. And also, while we're on the subject of your book, like when you first decided to publish it, was it almost like, is it fair to characterize you as brave for publishing it? Was it a difficult decision for you? Or did you have to like balance pros and cons? Like, if I do this, will I be canceled? Will I get a lot of hate? Did you have that kind of thought process before deciding to write this book?
I mean, people do often ask, you know, aren't you very brave, or do you feel very brave? And I always bristle, and I often wonder afterwards, like, what is it that bothers me about people asking me that? I mean, partly it's just embarrassing. Like, it's embarrassing to say, oh, yes, I'm so brave, I'm so amazing. So maybe it's partly that. But also, I genuinely thought I was going to be able to write it, continue with my career at The Economist, having got it out of my system. And the thing was, I was right from the point of view of The Economist. They did not in any way cancel me. My career, in fact, improved. Like I got promoted a couple of times while I was writing it and then afterwards.
That's great to hear.
It is. I mean, you know, and it's not even that they agreed. Like the editor did not agree with me when I was writing
even
it.
Better.
She doesn't like bullies and she does like free speech. So, you know, that was not an easy decision for her, and all kudos to her for that. But it just shows you, if you stand firm and you simply refuse to engage with the bullies, they leave you alone, actually.
Yes.
So I didn't have all those things on the line. I thought I didn't have the things on the line that a lot of other women have had, and I was right. What I didn't reckon with was that I would find everything else just too boring and distracting. So the job that I was doing when I left The Economist was Britain editor. So I was in charge of the 6 pages that we run on Britain every week. And, you know, that's a great job, like just a fantastic job. If someone had told me when I started at The Economist, when I was on the Britain section myself as a correspondent, that one day I would be the Britain editor, I simply wouldn't have believed them. And yet I didn't want to be doing it. Every day that I was thinking about, at the time, it was Boris Johnson and wretched cake and parties and the pandemic and, you know, the impact of Brexit, all things that I would otherwise have found fascinating. I had found an all-consuming passion, and that was actually a much more difficult decision to leave The Economist than to write the book. The book, I'll tell you why I decided to write it. I had decided that I wanted to, largely because I couldn't stop thinking about this subject, and I thought if I wrote it all down, it would clear my head and I'd feel better. And in a way, I did feel better, even though I didn't stop thinking about it. but I was held off from doing it because I just thought there must be somebody better to do it. Like, I was the finance editor of The Economist at the time. It was totally unconnected to everything else I was doing. And then I met some kids who had transitioned and regretted it. And so the oldest of that group was 23, and she had had her ovaries and her uterus removed when she was 21. And she now looked back at the grand old age of 23 and recognised that it had been her own internalised homophobia, she's lesbian, and also her really out of control eating disorder, which had made her believe that she was in the wrong body, and that was validated by the therapists. And, nobody helped her. They just made her worse, and they subjected her to a horrific medical scandal, like as bad as lobotomies, honestly. And I met a group of girls who had had this experience, and suddenly this sort of great sense of peace came across me. And I thought, oh, I know what to do. Like, that's what I wanted. I wanted to know what to do. It was that simple. And I just knew I have to write this book. I had been worrying about practicalities, like, would I have time? Would I find an agent? Would I find a publisher? And I just thought, like, that's all irrelevant. They're sterilising gay kids. I'll write it. If I have to sell it myself on Twitter, at this point I probably had about 20,000 followers, and I thought, that's not bad. And all I was talking about was gender stuff. I'll sell it via Twitter. I'll self-publish. I'll do what I have to do because they're sterilising gay kids. It was much harder to leave The Economist because I had one of the very few good jobs in journalism left. And that was tough decision. But in the end, with the editor's blessing, as I say, I left, and I so made the right decision. I'm so much happier doing the work that I know I should be doing. Like, I wake up every day knowing that I'm doing what I should be doing. And, it's quite depressing what I'm doing. Like, every day I'm thinking about children being harmed, women's rights being stolen, basically a global... it's not a conspiracy because that makes it sound like there's people behind the scenes doing it, but it feels like that, to steal our rights. But I know that I'm doing the right thing and I'm in the right place to try to stop it, and that I'm working with the right people, and that we are making headway. So I feel I have a purpose, and that makes up for everything else.
It has meaning, and that's the most important motivator, I guess.
Yeah.
But also, how was it when you first published it? How was it received? Did you get a lot of threats? Did you get a lot of cancellation attempts? Did you get all of that stuff, or how was the reception of it?
The reception was excellent. I got reviewed in a lot of papers, and mostly glowing reviews, like only a couple of bad reviews. Much better than I could ever have hoped. And, it has sold well. It's still selling well. I'm still coming on podcasts to talk about it all the time. I think people misunderstand what cancellation is like. Everything has been much harder for me than it would have been on literally any other subject. And they look at the fact that you managed to get through it, and they think that you're exaggerating, or there's this thing that people always say, like, she's so cancelled that she's been on Jordan Peterson. Like, you're so cancelled you're being quoted in the Telegraph paper. Like, that's not how cancellation works, because you can't see, like, other people don't see the things that I was turned down for, or that I never hear from again, or, like, I've never been on the BBC. My own home country, RTE, which RTE is the equivalent to the BBC in Ireland, like, has never had me on. And honestly, that I must be the first Irish woman who has gone abroad and written a bestseller who has not been on RTE about a million times. It's a small country, and RTE, anyone who does well, any Irish person who goes off and does well, they're just all over you. So I know what it would be like if I hadn't done this. And I also, I'm the one who sees my emails. I'm the one who knows. Like, I was invited on Sky, which is another TV channel. Obviously it's global, but Sky UK, and they recorded an entire program with me in their studio. And then they canned it and told me it was production difficulties. ABC, the Australian national broadcaster, did an entire radio interview with me. It said production difficulties afterwards. These are just little examples. I wrote an article for Schools Week, which is a specialist magazine, about what schools were getting wrong on trans stuff. They spiked it. I've lots of stories like that. And then I was at a free speech event in Ireland the weekend before last, and 4 journalists came up and told me stories about how the one and only thing they'd ever written on this subject was the one and only thing they'd ever had spiked. I mean, spiked means that it's been, it's not going to run. So one of them was a very well-known sort of, elder stateswoman of Irish journalism. And she said to me that she wrote her column the week my book came out about my book, and it was spiked, and they didn't run her column that week.
But
and another
why do
woman
you
came
think
up
that
and
is?
said, I mean, like from the publication's point of view, I've spent time thinking about it from their point of view. Like, they know they'll get inordinate grief on this topic, that they will get campaigners writing in, but also it's the people inside the publication, the young journalists. And I mean, I know when I started writing about this, editors, older people, commissioning editors, my age and older, they just thought the whole thing was insane. So insane that they thought it couldn't be happening, that I had to be exaggerating. And if they said, oh yeah, that sounds really interesting, write me something, they'd read what I wrote and they'd think that this is barking mad. Like it's like she's writing a conspiracy theory here. It's so insane. Like, it cannot be the case that the big gay rights organizations in the UK are seriously saying that heterosexual men can call themselves women and become lesbians. But of course they are saying that. And so so they start with this premise that you're mad and that you've not done your reporting and what you've written is completely crazy. And they come back to you and you try and persuade them, and then they put the thing through the system, and then in come the young people, especially the young people in the LGBT affinity groups. And they say, this is hurtful to the trans community. She doesn't understand. This is backward thinking. This will offend younger readers. And now the editor is really like, shit, and the deadline's approaching. And you're thinking, oh God, have I got something wrong here? And you feel all at sea because it's all mad. And so they just don't run it, or they hold it. I mean, one woman told me a very interesting story in Ireland, nothing to do with me. It was a paper that found a particular school. Like, this has come to Ireland good and hard now, but it's come very recently because Ireland's a very small C conservative country. We don't jump on these trends early. And it's a teacher who had come back, a primary school teacher, and the kids had come back for the autumn term, and this teacher calls herself they, them. MX, like MX instead of Mr. or Miss or Mrs. or Ms. And the children were told they had to call this teacher they, them, not she. And this journalist came up and she said she was the person who had, I think, commissioned it. And it was a short, 800 words news item, the sort of thing you write in a few hours and that papers are full of. She said that article took 3 journalists a whole week to prepare, to get through all the internal challenges, to get legal, to get fact checked, to get quote checked a dozen times, and then another 3 journalists a whole week to respond to the literally hundreds of coordinated complaints from outside the paper, and also the coordinated complaints inside the paper from young people saying, the fact that you published this article counts as harassment against me. This is part of the genocide of trans people, like completely overblown, crazy claims. So that's 6 weeks of work for one 800-word article. Would you ever commission that again? I mean, journalism is dying on its feet for lack of money. You can't do that. So I think of it as a sort of, there's a blind spot. Like, a lot of it is cancellation, but a lot of it is a blind spot where everybody just looks the other way and doesn't look at this story, because if they do, they don't know what to do with it. They know that it's going to be a world of trouble and grief.
And they're also afraid of their sponsors, I guess, and advertisers, and they really dearly have to hold on to them for their life, right? When the journalism,
yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't think. I think that if you stand up to them, like if you don't buckle, like, is it really the case that there are very large numbers of people who are actually in charge of family budgets, who actually have a lot of money, who quite seriously think there should be men competing in women's sports, and who seriously want children told that biological sex isn't real? Like, these are still marginal beliefs, and they're still marginal beliefs that are held by a thin sliver of young people who don't have much money and are not paying for newspaper subscriptions anyway, let's face it. Like, it's older people who are doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, The Economist has not seen a problem from being sensible on this issue. And because The Economist has no bylines, it's important I should say that after I wrote my first article on this, I didn't write another for The Economist. It was decided that I was too much associated with one side of the argument.
I see.
But other colleagues wrote many things, and there are still people at The Economist doing excellent work on this topic. And I mean, The Economist is still doing fine. It's doing better than many other publications.
Yeah.
What happens is people, they lose their nerve the first time, and after that it's over. Like if you give in to the bullies once, they know that you are weak and that you will give in, and they come back for more.
Who was it that said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself? It's something like
that is a saying, and it's not completely true. I mean, people have lost their jobs and so on, and this. But like the idea that sponsors and so on, or that newspaper readers like this stuff. Newspaper readers hate this stuff.
Yeah.
If you ever do opinion polls and you ask the questions clearly, because that's another thing, a lot of people don't understand this weird activist language. But if you ask clear questions that say things like, a trans woman is a man who identifies as a woman. This person may or may not have had any surgery. Do you think this person should be allowed into female sports or female changing rooms or whatever? You will get large majorities of every age group saying no. And I mean, I'm sure some of them want to write hell no.
Yeah.
But you're not giving them that option. So it is not a popular belief system.
No.
I think that where you do see genuine fear and genuine justified fear is in the charitable sector. So if you, or also anyone who has a sponsor. So the reason that a lot of female athletes don't talk out about the fact that men are being allowed to identify into women's sports is that they rely on sponsorship money.
Yeah.
And sponsors are cowards. Like, they know that people don't like this stuff, but they just want you to stay off everything controversial.
Yeah.
So they want you to just be somebody who stands up and says, like, just keep trying.
Yeah, just vanilla stuff.
Girls can succeed or whatever it is. They don't want you getting into anything political.
Yeah, I get it. But
and the same with charities.
Yeah. I can imagine. I want to dive deep into this, like trying to find the underlying things about this stuff, because I think it's often easy to get stuck in all the symptoms of a wave of something. But one thing I really like to do on my podcast is try to dive deep into it and see all these large waves of what's really going on. So I'm trying to think about this, all this movement that happened, like. What could we say, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, with this dysphoria and everything. And also, first off, right off the bat, I want to say that, of course, I acknowledge that some people are actually trans people, and probably for some people, for a minority of people, it's the right thing to do, perhaps. But I think that the problem is with gender correcting surgery and this whole wave that we're seeing, is that we're overtreating or also having a medical malpractice in regards to this stuff. So, but I've been trying to think what this stuff is all about.
While you think what you want to ask me, can I just push back a bit on what you've just said?
Yeah.
So, I mean, people generally start with, like, sensible people generally start with what you've just said. Yes, I accept that there are some trans people, but there's also a social contagion. I don't accept that there are any people who are trans in the sense that the lobbyists mean it.
Okay.
So what they mean is that there are some male people who are, in some genuine sense, really female, or vice versa. I don't believe that. I don't believe there's ever or ever will be a male person who's really female. So what we might mean is there are some people whose gender dysphoria is spontaneous. I mean, dysphoria is just a fancy word for distress. But that there might be some people who, out of nowhere, it's not a contagion, for whatever reason, really strongly feel that they were meant to be members of the other sex.
Yeah.
There probably are people like that. Very few. The incidence used to be thought to be 1 in 30 to 150,000.
Those are the ones I'm talking about.
But still, what are we to do with those people? Like, there's a whole load of assumptions next. Like, the next assumption is that person will be better if they transition. There's no evidence of that.
Yeah, exactly.
No evidence whatsoever.
That's true.
Also, what about other people? Like, this is the bit that the gender doctors never thought about in the century that they've been doing this sort of experimentation, a bit less than a century. They never thought, what does this mean for other people? So if we think of a man called George, And suppose George is the most perfect trans woman in the world. Like George is somebody who really, truly, from tiny, genuinely knew he was meant to be a girl.
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to say to George, okay, you're really trans, we'll do the surgeries on you when you're old enough to consent. What next? What
Yeah.
George wants is to be allowed into women's spaces, to be allowed into women's sports, to be treated as a woman for the purposes of jobs that are only for women. And those jobs are things like, doing mammograms on women to check for cancer. George can't be a woman as far as women are concerned in any space where it matters that everybody around you is a woman. So we cannot give George what he wants without trampling on women's rights. And that's the bit that the doctors never included. They told George, yes, we can do this surgery and you will feel better and women will accept you as a woman. And that last bit was never true. So I'm afraid I don't think that there are any trans people in the sense the lobbyists mean. I don't think there are any people who can be taken out of their sex and slotted back into the other sex without destroying everybody else's rights, even if they'd be happier.
And also, I think that there's not necessarily an automatic jump from feeling like you're in the wrong gender to actually going and having some kind of medical surgery. You don't have to have
completely. I mean, we know that those feelings pass for the majority of children.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So at least 80%. I mean, 80% is the most commonly cited figure. A child who thinks very ardently and strongly that I was meant to be, or I actually am, a member of the opposite sex is at least 80% likely, if you don't play along with it, to stop feeling that. By the way, they're very likely to be gay.
Yeah.
That's the most usual origin of early childhood feelings that you were meant to be the opposite sex. So we're actually sterilizing gay kids when we put kids onto these treatment pathways. Like it's not just a human rights abuse, it's a homophobic human rights abuse.
Yes, because I wrote down some notes from listening to your book. I listened to it as an audiobook, and I really liked the one where you're talking about the study from March 2021, where you had 139 boys in Toronto and data from 1975 to 2009, where 2/3 of them met the criteria for dysphoria. And then the findings were that 90% of them stopped feeling dysphoric either before puberty or in early puberty, and all of them, the majority, stopped having feelings. Yeah, the great majority stopped having feelings of dysphoria.
Yeah,
that's the kind of stuff most people don't know.
We know. So this idea that you can be, really of one sex, whereas you're physically of the other. Like, first of all, that's not right. You can't. There's no sense in which that's true. Second, if you feel like it's true that surgery is the right thing to do, no, we know what the right thing to do is, which is to be supportive and kind to you, to, not force you into situations you're uncomfortable with, but not to lie to you and pander to you. Then thirdly, even if you're one of the people who makes it through all of that, still thinking you're meant to be a member of the opposite sex, you might be somebody who wants to have bits of you chopped off, but the evidence isn't good that this will make you feel any better. You might think it will, but these are very dodgy operations. Fourthly, even if we get to that point, the thing that you want is something you can never have without destroying other people's rights.
Yeah.
And other people will not let you. So this is all, the whole thing, at every stage it fails.
Because also, what do we know about the evidence from the ones who actually go all the way to gender-correcting surgery and all that? What does the evidence say about how they feel afterwards, and like suicide rates and depression?
Yeah.
And what does the evidence say?
You will be astounded not to know that the gender clinics very rarely do long-term follow-ups. Any studies that have been done recently have been so badly designed that I can only think it's intentional, and have done very short follow-ups, like less than a year, sometimes just 3 months. But I mean, everybody has euphoria 3 months after something this. So the one and only study that you could look at and say it's giving you decent long-term evidence is one from Sweden, and the thing about Sweden is that all the surgeries, it started doing these surgeries relatively early. It did them in the public healthcare system. It has a national ID system so that you can track the person. So it doesn't have the problems that a lot of studies have where there's a high dropout rate and you know that the dropout people are probably different from the other ones, so you end up with a biased finding. So this was unbiased and it was complete. So they tracked the few hundred men who had had surgery to remove their penises and testicles and create what's called a neovagina, like a new cavity which is made out of the skin of the penis. And those people, they also got their legal sex changed, their legal sex marker changed. Now, not many of them changed back, which, it's hard to know what to make of that, because what's the point in changing back? You've changed your body so much. But those people went on to have very high suicide rates, much higher than the general population. Like they matched them with people of the same sex and of the same target sex, very high suicide rates. They might have had higher suicide rates if they hadn't done the surgery. We don't know. But also their crime patterns were those of men, not women. So men commit really nearly all violent crime and really, really nearly all sexual crime. So these men were much more like men in terms of their offending pattern. And when you think that women's spaces, like the strongest and most obvious reason for women's spaces is to protect women from male violence and male sexual violence, these are not people you should be allowing into women's spaces. Like, okay, they can't rape you, they haven't got a penis, but they're still bigger and stronger. They still have male attitudes to violence, etc., etc. So that's the best study, but it's also very old. And attitudes may have changed. So that's one of the things that the trans lobby says is that, you know, all the bad outcomes from that were because of transphobia. They say these men would have been super happy living as trans women, except that society didn't accept them. But that's bullshit. I mean, this is Sweden we're talking about, for God's sake.
Yeah. I think that also,
I mean, the evidence is not good. Let's put it, at the very least, there is no good evidence that going through the surgery will make you feel any better, and a fair old reason to think that it will make you feel worse.
And I think it's so that they have such an unscientific approach to it. Why wouldn't they do follow-up studies? Why wouldn't they be interested in finding the truth about, is this good for people or not? Like, this is all evidence that it's an ideology. Yeah.
Yeah, if it's not a good idea, they've just committed a horrific human rights abuse.
So they didn't want to know.
Sweden did this thing of sterilizing, you know, undesirables, people who had low IQ or, you know, that they regarded as defective. Like, it was still sterilizing people well into the modern era. And this is now recognized as a grotesque human rights abuse, and people were paid compensation for it.
Yes.
Or you look at the experiments, the Tuskegee experiments in America, where they knowingly didn't treat black men who had syphilis to see what would happen. Or you look at lobotomies. You know, the people who do these things never accept that the evidence has gone against them. Like the guy who invented the lobotomy, he got the Nobel Prize for it, and he went on through the rest of his life believing that what he had done helped. Like, long after people had stopped doing lobotomies, he was still saying that was a good operation. Because if it wasn't, he was like, I don't even want to make comparisons with what he's like, but like, he has done the worst thing. So these people don't want to check. They know they're doing the right thing because, you know, everybody knows their gender identity. Children know themselves best, and that makes them feel good about themselves.
It's almost like your brain won't allow you to see what you're doing. It's like, see no evil, hear no evil, because you get these probably defense mechanisms that won't allow you to see what you're doing.
Yeah, it's too late now.
Do you feel like this whole gender correcting surgery, is this our time's lobotomy?
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course, except worse because it's being done on children.
Yeah. Exactly. Back to, but also I think that the evidence that it is an ideology or a religion is that also the ones that regret and detransition, they are shunned from the community. They are banned.
Completely. They're treated like apostates.
Yeah.
You know, they're like, what is it that Scientologists call people who leave? I think it's suppressive persons. And you have to treat them complete outcasts, never speak to them again. That's the way that detransitioners are treated. Now, if this wasn't an ideology, you'd be like, oh God, I'm really sorry we misdiagnosed you. We thought you were trans and you're not. But the thing is that the only evidence for someone being trans is they say they're trans. And the only diagnostic tool for giving people these treatments is they say they want them. So once somebody says, I'm trans, I want them, you do the surgeries, and then they say you made a mistake, you're casting doubt on everybody. It's not like other medical mistakes. So if you're somebody, I mean, I have problems with my Achilles tendons, and I had to have an operation on them. And I was given all the information beforehand about what success rates were, what possible complications were. Like, suppose I'd been one of the people who had complications. Fortunately, I wasn't. I couldn't come back to them and say, you were wrong to do this operation. No, I was just one of the unlucky ones. And I mean, of course, they might have done it badly or something, but just, I mean, if they'd done everything right and I was one of the 10% or whatever, that's very sad. But that's not what the gender doctors can say to these detransitioners. No, you know, they don't know the success rate. They're not doing follow-ups, and they can't tell what was different about this person than everybody else. It's all the same. It's all just people coming and telling doctors that they want things chopped off because they feel that they were meant to be members of the other sex. And so if you start paying attention to what detransitioners are telling you, you'd have to stop the whole thing.
So that's what's so crazy about that is that it would be one thing if it was just about grown-up adults, 18 plus, doing this to themselves, like horrible still. But another level of this is that it's actually about children. And I wrote some notes from your book again, like this person who's called Diane Ehrensaft, who is a professor of pediatrics in California. She thinks that kids down to the age of 3 should start gender affirming care, or on the process of gender affirming care. It's like, how can you be even the expression of informed consent doesn't even apply in like theoretical
Yeah, but they
terms.
weren't thinking about informed consent. You know,
Yeah.
they're not working within the medical paradigm. It's like
Mhm.
I said, this is a religion that's being treated as a civil rights movement. What they're doing only looks like medicine. It's an ideology that's inhabiting medicine. So in medicine, you like the way that medicine works, and this is why I think it's, you know, I heard you say it's still horrible with adults, so I'm not disagreeing with you, but people often say, I support adults' right to do whatever they like with their bodies. I'm kind of like, sort of, yeah. I mean, do I support doctors telling people falsehoods about how good that will make them feel afterwards? Do I think this should be paid for on taxpayers' money? Like, if there's something that people want to do, like there's these random people in America usually who do these crazy cosmetic surgeries to, you know, make their tongues forked or to cut off their ears or to make themselves look like snakes or cats or something. Like, most of us recognize that as mental illness, and very few doctors go along with it. And if they do, it's never covered by insurance or the national healthcare system. And, you know, if you were a doctor doing these things, I hope your medical malpractice insurance is really good. So, yeah, in that sense, yes, okay. If we understood gender medicine as at that level of body modification, you know, I'd still think it was unethical.
Yeah.
But would I necessarily think it should be banned for adults? Probably not. Like, there are people who do these weird snake cat surgeries as well.
Yeah.
But on children, like when you're doing medicine, there's a theory behind what you're doing. Like it's not just chopping people up and, you know, sticking in implants or whatever. You start with an idea of what healthy functioning is.
Yeah.
Like if we think of my Achilles tendons, like we know what a healthy Achilles tendon does, and we know how it breaks down and what causes it to break down. And then there's there's what's called differential diagnosis, which is that you do different tests to try and work out which thing it is. And then you try from the least invasive treatment up to the most invasive treatment over time. So I had to do a load of physio, and, you know, there was a long process before I ended up on the operating table for it. And at every point, they're trying to bring me back to healthy functioning. They know what the Achilles tendon is meant to do, and they're trying to make my Achilles tendon do that. Gender medicine's nothing like that. The person starts with a healthy body.
Yeah.
And the things that you're doing to them make their bodies unhealthy.
Yeah.
Puberty blockers are probably bad for their brains, pretty definitely bad for their bones, absolutely bad for their reproductive systems. We can't turn a male reproductive system into a female one or vice versa, not at all. We can just do a really, really poor visual version of it that is non-functional and that causes ongoing problems and that has very high failure rates. We are making the person sterile, so we're making their body, we're destroying a major function of the body. And we're doing this without any evidence that it makes people feel better, because, I mean, that'd be one thing. Like if the outcome was that this person was freed from all their misery, then at least there'd be that. But there just isn't a theory behind it. It's not medicine.
Yeah, and it's like doctors, don't they have like the Hippocratic oath where they say do no harm is like the first principle of everything that they do?
Yeah, but then these doctors, they're not doctors. Like what Diane Ehrensaft said, and so there's this group called Fourth Wave now in the US, and it's not so active anymore because it was set up by a few parents whose children were transitioning, like quite early, 2013, 2014, 2015, that sort of time. Great group of people, and there's one of them I talked to quite a lot for my book. And they sent people to seminars and so on, because this was when the trans ideologues could say what they liked to anybody and there was no pushback. So they actually recorded Diane Ehrensaft speaking in a seminar. They recorded the whole thing. And in it, she says, I think it was 2-year-olds, but maybe it was 3-year-olds. They knew that the gender identity is that you have it before you even can speak. She said it's probably in the womb, that you have your gender identity in the womb. And then she said that a pre-verbal child can signal their gender identity with their clothing. And what she said was that a baby girl might pull, and to me it's called a hair clip, but Americans call it a barrette, like, these things that you hold a little girl's hair back with. She might pull that out and throw that down, and that's the baby girl signaling that she's really a boy.
Really?
Or a boy who's wearing a onesie, like, those things that pop fasten under the nappy or under the diapers. A little boy might unpop those to make a little skirt, and that's the baby boy signaling to you that he's a girl. I mean, have you ever heard anything as crazy? I've been thinking about this stuff for 6 years. It's insane. So how can she think this? How can a woman who's been through medical school think this? And it's because it's a religion.
Yeah.
She's not using the bit of her brain that did all those textbooks that she sat exams on. She's starting from the premise. She's doing policy-based evidence making. Her policy is everybody has a gender identity, and she knows that as an article of faith. It's like one of her 10 commandments. So she starts from that premise. Well, if everybody has a gender identity and it's innate, then you're born with it. And if that's true, all the little babies pop out, and some of the babies, their gender identity, a pink brain went in the blue body or whatever. How does that baby signal? Well, I mean, if that premise was right, which it's not because it's crazy, but if it was, maybe the little girl would pull her barrette out. So then you can kind of understand her. But the thing to understand about all of this is the rest of us do not have to go along with it, and shouldn't, because it's mad.
Yeah.
But also, she's not going to be amenable to any evidence, because this was not evidence. There's a famous Christopher Hitchens saying, he said, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Yeah.
The rest of us should just dismiss this.
Yeah. I have the impression that the medical culture and the medical laws and regulations, that it's so strict, like especially in America, where you have like where doctors are probably so afraid of medical malpractice, and they can get sued for everything and anything. You have to have papers and sign here, and it's like, how does that kind of culture of being really, really prudent and strict and following the rules of the game, and how does that combine so easily with this whole new religion coming in and saying that you can do all this crazy stuff that everybody understands is crazy?
It's a really good question. And I mean, institutional capture is the two-word answer. So, I mean, doctors have always been much shadier and more experimental than those of us who aren't doctors know. Like, I read a lot of medical history when I wrote the book. And doctors are a bit prone to crazes. So, there've been many things like lobotomies, but that's just the very striking example. Women, right through the last 200 years, which is basically the period of modern medicine, over and over again, doctors have thought that what's wrong with women means you should take out their uteruses or their ovaries, or sometimes take off their clitoris. Like, it's amazing. Doctors just settle on what's wrong with this crazy woman, or this unhappy woman, or this woman who's sleeping around, or this woman who argues with her husband, take out her reproductive organs. Like, they do this over and over again. It's amazing. And then the next thing is that, like, modern medicine, it's like modern science. It's very specialist now. So most doctors only know a little bit of it. And they're constantly referring people or having people referred to them. And medical ethicists talk about the chain of trust. So if, say, you're an endocrinologist, so that's someone who deals with hormones and the hormonal system, people are referred to you for all sorts of different things. It may be about diabetes, maybe about, having problems with your adrenal gland, maybe to get cross-sex hormones, maybe because, you've got precocious puberty, like you're going into puberty at age 4 or 5, lots of different reasons, but someone else refers you, and you have to trust that that person has done their job. Of course, you're going to do your tests on them too. When they're referred for gender dysphoria to an endocrinologist, you're only looking at their endocrine system. You're not looking at their mental functioning. So you have to trust that the person who referred them has done all of that. And the fact is they haven't. They've pretended to. Possibly pretended to themselves as well. But I mean, there is no way of really checking that somebody is really a member of the opposite sex. So now you, the endocrinologist, you're only dealing with their endocrine system, and then you refer them on for surgery. And the surgeon believes that everybody's done the right thing up till now. And so what ends up happening is that somebody who's possibly a child has been through this whole system where they've gone from a general practitioner to a psychological professional of some sort, to an endocrinologist, to a surgeon, and nobody has actually taken responsibility for, the path this person is on. Each of them has just done their bit of it and trusted everybody else. And at the end of it, you've got a person who's been sterilized and given a treatment that we know now, we've no reason to think it works. But nobody's taken responsibility. And then you asked about suing. What protects doctors from being sued is that they follow the standards of their profession. And the tragic thing is that in America, the American Association of Pediatrics, which is there are two associations for pediatricians in America, and this is by far the larger one. It puts out guidance for pediatricians on all sorts of subjects, because pediatricians, they're specialists in children, but they have to be generalists in what goes wrong with children.
Yeah.
So they need help on all these different things that children can have. And the guidance that was put out in, I think, 2018 by the AAP was written by a small subcommittee, which was captured by a couple of trans activists. And it says, that gender affirming care, and that's the giving healthcare on the basis that people are whatever sex they say they are, that is evidence-based. And it misquotes papers. It quotes papers that say the exact opposite of what it claims they say. It says things like, there's one paper I remember, it says that this shows that gender affirmation makes mental functioning better. But if you look the paper up, it's actually about sexual orientation, not gender identity, and it's about adults, not children. So it's a completely fictitious document. But on the basis of that, the AAP says that to all the pediatricians in America, the standards of care are that if a child comes into you and says, I'm really a boy or I'm really non-binary, you give them puberty blockers, you give them cross-sex hormones, you refer them for having their breasts cut off if it's a girl. You may even do genital surgery before they're 18. And when that is what the AAP says, that's a very strong shield for the doctor. And then,
So
then there's also the international.
That.
It's the international people as well. WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. Sounds grand, doesn't it? It's actually an activist organization that's largely made up of trans people rather than trans clinicians. It's a mixture of both. And so their standards of care are barking mad. There's an entire chapter on eunuchs. Literally the heading is eunuchs. It's about the gender identity of eunuch. I mean, I feel like I'm living in a nightmare when I see this.
It's crazy.
And yet people say, oh, this is the the international standards of care. This is written by people who think that you could be born with the gender identity of someone who's had all their genitals cut off.
Yeah. Well, we have to dive deep into this. Where is this coming from? What is all of this? What is it about? I've been trying to think, here's some of my ideas. Perhaps this is coming from a starting point of postmodernism, where everything is relative, where there is no objective fact anymore. It's whatever floats your boat, whatever you say goes. That, and also combined with perhaps a victim culture, where we try to we want to appreciate all the victims in society, so we have a lot of focus on that, and also breaking the idea of breaking free from oppressing and narrow categories. Your gender is just a category. You have to break free from the shackles. Some of that, and also another idea is sex. Sexual stuff is so omnipresent in our society. It's sex everywhere on TV, magazines, screens. So the idea of sex itself is at the forefront of our minds. So perhaps that is something. And also we have a society that is almost hyper fixated on tolerance and empathy, which is not to say that those are bad values. Of course they're good values, but we forget another value, which is truth. We also have to have truth into this picture, because if you go all the way with tolerance and empathy, you can do a lot of evil with those two values by themselves, and also combined with fear of speaking up, of course, with peer pressure and the fear of cancellation. Those are some of the ideas I'm thinking about.
And I agree with all of them, and I probably would have said all of those. I mean, you put that really, really, really well. I mean, so I don't see any reason to repeat what you just said. I endorse all of it, and I'm trying to think what I can add to it. I think these long-run trends, the trend towards individualism and liberalism. But, like all of these things, these are good things. It's just they're not everything. They're not all the values. We got so much out of being more liberal when that meant that, you weren't fixed into your parents' religion and your parents' status in life and so on, and that women could do things as well as men. Like, it brought us such a long way. But it's as if liberalism has come up to the natural boundary, which is basically, you. There's a famous saying that, my right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the edge of liberalism. And I mean, some people like small c conservatives would say that that's still going too far, because sometimes there's things that you can do. A liberal will say you can do them. There shouldn't be a law against them, but they're not good things. They're not good for you. They're not moral. They're not making society better. And I would agree with that. But anyway, even if we ignore that fact, the fact is there's a limit to liberalism, and that's when it starts overstep into what is not yours to decide. And the swing your fist where where someone else's nose begins looks at the impact upon other people. But there's another natural boundary to liberalism, and that is at the boundary of the self. So I can redefine myself in many ways. I moved country, I gave up my religion, I have broken the bounds of what it is for a woman to do. I have a PhD in mathematics. But like if I start to think that I'm almost godlike, then I can do things like become a man or become immortal, or it's delusional. It's delusional thinking. I can be Napoleon, I can run the world, Well, we don't accept most of the delusions, but we do accept the delusion that I could change sex. And maybe that's, like you say, we're highly hypersexualized culture, like sex all the time.
Yeah.
And, and there are reasons why you might fixate on your sex as being the thing that is destroying your life. Like, we do still have part of the hypersexualized culture is that girls are meant to be quite pornified now, much more than when I was a child. And boys are meant to be like hyper masculine, like all this talk about, chads and, alpha and beta males, and he's cucked, and, the Andrew Tateism of the world. Yeah. Like, this is very unappealing to perhaps a shy or cerebral or just, a little bit, soft and nice teenage boy.
Yeah.
So you can totally see why it would fixate on the sex. And then individualism, like this insistence that, what feels right to you is what is right. Like, we used to understand that was demonic, actually. Like, that's what Aleister Crowley or Nietzsche or someone like that would say, that, do what they will, 'tis the end of the law. Like, that's all there is, just do what you want. So those things that we've taken those things to where their natural boundary is and then gone further. Postmodernism, yes, that there is no truth underlying what we're saying. There is no single truth. And again, there was so much to that. Like the idea that the omnipotent gaze of the middle-aged white European man defined the whole world, and that there weren't other ways of looking at things. Like, obviously it was great when we started seeing things different ways. What it looked like to women, what it looked like to colonized people, what it looked like to non-Christians. Doesn't mean there's no there. Like, that has also gone too far. Yeah. Some things are socially constructed and some things aren't, or some things are only partially socially constructed. I mean, I think we have to include the internet, because if you look at the social contagion aspect of it, I read a really interesting book about the history of medical malpractice and social contagions. That it was written in the 1990s. And it said that, since the dawn of modern medicine, which is about 200 years ago, doctors and patients have co-constructed illnesses, mental or somatic illnesses. So a somatic illness is something that it's a mental condition in the sense that it's how you feel or how you're thinking, and it plays out in your body. People tend to think it's invented. It's not invented. The feelings are very real. And you may somatize by vomiting, by being paralyzed, by going blind. Like, they can be incredibly real things, but it's to do with your cognition expressed on your body. So somebody who has a general feeling of ill ease, and often that's centered on your abdomen, because there's an awful lot goes on in our abdomens, like, a load of squishy stuff in there, and it's very hard to tell which bit is the problem. Is it your breathing? Is it your digestion? Is it your reproductive organs? And so somebody who feels very ill at ease often feels pain and discomfort in their abdomen, and they go into their doctor, and then the doctor and the patient together talk through these symptoms and they shape them into something that's a recognizable syndrome. And those syndromes vary from culture to culture. So one way of looking at what's happening now is that the somatizing is settling on this idea of gender or the sexed body. And again, that's really your abdomen, like chest to groin.
Yeah.
And a patient who goes into a doctor now, one of the possible things the doctor will talk about is their gender identity, which they would not have done even 10 years ago, and certainly not 20 years ago. And so together they shape the unhappiness, which may be, teenage angst or whatever, they shape it into a gender disorder, when another time it might have been a different disorder. Anyway, so this book said that doctors do this, and then there was quite a section on the media and how the media spread these ideas too. And at the time, in the 1990s, that meant newspapers and television stations. And it gave some very interesting examples of how that was done, like Lyme disease, what's the tiredness one, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah.
Like, these are ideas that are spread in magazines and newspapers. And then after this book was written, along came the internet and social media.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about social media from this point of view is that some of it is child to child.
Yeah.
So sites like Tumblr and TikTok are places where children talk directly to each other without adults mediating what they've done. And it's super fast and it's global. And because they're talking about something, they're children, they're prone to wild swings in mood, in theories. They're not very experienced. They're risk-seeking. They don't have much life experience to explain to them, what might, slow down here, let's think this through. And then they've landed on this thing, gender, which is totally dissociated from anything real, so it's untethered. And then it just cycles off into absolute absurdity. People identifying as unicorn gender, or saying that they
it's
are
a fantasy world,
animals, or that they've got multiple personalities, or their different personalities have different genders. And then this goes into the clinical setting when they go to see their doctor. And then the doctor concretizes something that was just a children going crazy together thing. And then before you know it, that child's been sterilized.
It's like a fantasy world where what's also appalling now is that I've heard, like in the US and also here in Norway, where we're going to have that kind of laws which says that the therapist in the therapy room with the patient, if the patient is expressing thoughts or feelings about perhaps being in the wrong body and wrong gender, you're not allowed to even question that assumption that the patient has, that you can lose your license from that. So that you have that, like the perfect storm, right, where the patient is like a teen or somebody who has mental issues in your youth, and then you have these ideas, and then you go to the psychologist, and psychologists aren't allowed to even question your conclusions about what's wrong with you, and then you're sent on to this whole package deal of getting your sex changed. So it's like the perfect setup for the
completely.
For the
and
worst
one thing
situation.
I should have added, and I'd be interested to know if this is in Norway as well. I'm sure it is. We have a lot of rent seeking in society, like maybe more than we've ever had before. I mean, economists use the phrase rent seeking to mean somebody who gets themselves into a privileged position where they can take a slice of the money that other people make, but they're not actually productive themselves. The same way, if you're the lucky person who owns some land and then someone builds a shop on that, you can take some of the money that's made from that shop, but you're not actually doing anything.
Yeah.
So there's loads of things that happen in a modern, complex economy to do with government regulation in particular that is categorized as rent seeking. And one of those is complying with human resources laws and practices. So if you're a company and you have to, not be sexist, not be racist, all those are good things, of course. But the fact is that those laws that have been made permit somebody to put themselves into a situation or into a position where they can say they offer training. And that training will help you, the company, to satisfy these laws. Now, you're not helping to make the company any better. You're not helping to make its products or anything or make it more productive. You are rent seeking.
Yeah.
And the more complex we make our societies, and the more we have these special characteristics that have to be protected, like gender identity, like race, sexual orientation, all the things, like good things, bad things, and different things, we're opening up rent seeking. And one of the big rent-seeking things to do is to talk about sexual orientation. And the sorts of charities and training organizations that do this were set up for a really good reason, which is that gay people were oppressed. They were treated really badly by the law. And so these great organizations got set up, did fantastic work, reached the point where really genuinely in a big city, it's highly unlikely you're going to be discriminated against in work for being gay. You can get married, you can adopt, you're really treated equally in the law. Those organizations no longer have a reason to exist, but they want to continue to exist. And so in both America and the UK, and in Ireland too, and I bet you in Norway, those organizations switched to doing trans stuff instead, so they could continue with this rent seeking. Yeah. And so now, instead of saying to companies, if you offer free travel or a discount in the company store to wives and husbands, do you also do that to same-sex partners?
Yeah.
That sort of thing, which is a good thing. Now they come in and say, do you have gender-neutral toilets? Do you allow your non-binary staff to have 2 lanyards with different identities? Do you make sure that a man who identifies as a woman can use the women's shower room? They don't phrase it like that, but that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
And so we've now got this lobby that's pushing for all of this stuff because it doesn't want to just go, fold up and go away.
But what do you think about, because I listened to your episode with Jordan Peterson. You were talking about gender as one of the primary categories of all categories. It was like, I remember he's saying like it was older than trees, 1.2 billion years old. Why do we have this kind of opposition against categories? Do you think that is some of it too?
Absolutely. That was one of the most interesting. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jordan, and that was one of the most interesting things he said. So I've thought a lot about that afterwards, and there is this feeling, and it's one of the long run trends. I mean, you mentioned some of them: individualism, liberalism, postmodernism. One of them is this hostility to categories, this idea that categories are in themselves oppressive.
Yeah.
And like so many things, wisdom is balance. I don't know if you have kids. I've got 2 kids. They're pretty grown up
2
now.
kids
but
also.
Yeah. And I mean, anyone who's a parent knows that children thrive on some freedom and some boundaries.
Yeah.
And, you as a parent, you keep them safe by setting clear boundaries about things like, bedtime, behavior, and so on. And they need those. They feel safe when there are boundaries. They feel like they're held. But also you can't restrict them too much. You have to allow them freedom to be their own sweet little selves and to explore a bit and, grow up. So there's balance there. And I think it's the same with categories. Like, I don't think any of us wants to be put into every pigeonhole and treated like we are just the product of our upbringing. I mean, a lot of us bristle when somebody says, oh, you're very middle class, or that's just what I'd think of somebody, who'd been to that university. But at the same time, those things are structure for us. People also structure themselves by being their nationality, by where they went to university, by their religions or whatever. And these things give structure to your life and shape to them and meaning. But it's like we've forgotten that entirely. And all we think about is the unfettered self, the free self, the self-defining self, the self-creating self. And then you think, well, okay, are there any categories that I'm going to accept as given? Or is every category something that's just people trying to impose things on me? And I mean, if you talk to young people, they take it as a given that categories are inherently oppressive. So I only really realized this recently, which is something considering that I've been doing this for about 6 years now. It's really taken as given by academics working in the field of gender that when governments record a child's sex at birth, what they're doing is coercive. Those academics think that they will even sometimes write coercively assigned female or male at birth. Like as if the government should just have waited until you could tell them which you were.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is extraordinary. I mean, this is like saying coercively assigned human at birth. So what I think we said when I was talking to Jordan, and I thought more about it afterwards, is it's a hostility and a rebellion against the fact that we have got a mortal nature. Like, I was born, I will die. I'm an atheist. I don't think I'm going to exist after I'm dead. I live only one life, and I'm going to do hardly any of the things that I would like to do in that time because there's a trillion things I'd like to do and I won't have time to do all of them. And also, they're just not available to me. I'm in one place. It's very sad when you think, actually, how little you'll ever get to be or do of what it could have been.
Yeah.
And especially if you have this mindset that self-definition, self-creation, self-exploration is all, and there's nothing to the safety and comfort of the structures around you. So if you think like that, if you think that creating yourself is everything, you probably rebel against the fact of your body, the fact that you can't fly, the fact that you can't breathe water, the fact that you won't live forever, the fact that your body starts to get sick and bits break as you get older. But there's just not a lot you can do about any of it, because all of those things are inherent to being human. But there's one thing that there are two versions of, and that's your sex. So it's the only thing that's both fundamental to humans and varies. Like, we all breathe air, we all eat food, we all need to sleep, but some of us are male and some of us are female. So I think there's something to that it's the one really fundamental thing that you can lie about as a human.
Do you think there is like an opposition to God as well, because you have
Yeah,
in the
I'm
Bible?
an atheist.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking about like how our society is structured. I think it could be in opposition to God, even if you're not religious, because it's like one of the fundamental structures where you have, like, if you read the Bible, it says that God created humans in His image, and to male and female He created them. Like, that is one of the primary things that it says, like in the beginning of it all. And perhaps people have this kind of, they want to break free from all kinds of shackles, and they want to break free from that as well.
Yeah, I think they want to break free of all kinds of shackles, and there's some that, they're just too stupid to even start with. Like, if someone says I'm immortal, like, what good does that do after they've died?
Yeah.
If someone says that I can go without food indefinitely, they're welcome to try, but they can't.
Yeah.
But you could say that you're the opposite sex, and then other people can just be forced to go along with you. And then, there's this reflexive anti-religion thing. I wonder, was I ever like this? I think I might have been. I think I might have been, a bit new atheisty in my 20s and 30s even. But there's this sort of, if it's religious, it's bad. And I if I ever did feel like that, I definitely don't feel like it anymore. I think, but I see it around me. So I think a lot of people feel if it says this in the Bible, it must be bad. And they also grotesquely mishear what people like me say. This is hard for me to accept because it's so stupid, but it happens all the time. So I say something like, male people just can't be female, and female people just can't be male. Like, it's just not possible for me to be a man or for you to be a woman. And they hear me as saying, Helen Joyce thinks that women should have to stay home in the kitchen and, be a 1950s housewife and not go to university and obey her husband. And Henrik must be, a pillar of the community who goes out to earn. And, if he wears a skirt, it's a disaster, and he must never smile or cry. And I never said any of those things. I just said, you can't be a woman and I can't be a man. It's like they hear the opposite of what I'm saying. Like, what I'm saying is, if I do all the things that you weren't meant to do in the 1950s, I'm still a woman. And if you wear a skirt and put on lipstick and have surgery and, become a hairdresser and get interested in flowers, you're still a man. But they hear me as saying the opposite. It's like there's just none so deaf as those who will not hear. It's very, very, very irritating to have people constantly saying the opposite of what I'm actually saying.
Yeah, that's what I think also. I've been talking about that point before, that it's so paradoxical, this whole focus on the gender dysphoria, because it makes the categories of what it means to be a man or a woman smaller. Like, that is so paradoxical, because before it was like, when I went to school when I was 7, 8, or 9 or 10 years old, some girls were like, tomboys. They like the things, they like to skateboard, they like, they were more perhaps masculine, and some boys like to wear like more pink, or they like to wear dresses or whatever. It's like, you're still a boy. Like, some boys are more feminine, some girls are more masculine. and paradoxically, now those categories are just going smaller and smaller and smaller. And if a boy says to a counselor or somebody at school, like, I think I like more feminine stuff, like you're sent on this whole track to changing your gender. And I want to get into that, because that is also something that I wrote down from your book, the case from British Columbia in Canada, where there's this case where you're talking about where school counselor just decides on a whim that the girl is trans after a little girl is talking to him about having trans feelings, and refers the kid to a doctor for puberty blockers, and then later for sex change operations. And he asks the parents to sign, and the father refuses to sign because he thinks it's all rubbish. And then actually in Canada, they can go ahead and do that anyway, that experimental treatment, because they don't have to get the parents' consent. And at the same time, the father is also sentenced for family violence for not signing off on it. And the courts, in addition, the court bans him from talking to the press. Yet when he talks about it, and then he's arrested in March 2021. It's just a crazy, crazy situation.
But there are
where you have
loads of stories like this now, loads, and not just in Canada. I mean, this sort of thing has happened in the UK. It happens in many American states. It happens all over Australia. There have been more cases in Canada. I mean, it just all starts from the foundational lie. Like, if you believe that people are born with gender identities, I mean, if that were true, suppose it were really true that all of us had a switch in our heads that went male or female or stuck somewhere in between. And people came out, and usually if you were a male body, it pointed to male, and usually if you were female, it pointed to female, but every now and then it was wrong. Suppose that was true. And suppose that you infallibly knew what your switch was pointed to, and as soon as you could talk, you told people about it. Well, then we would do all of this. We would put the children on these treatments. We would say that parents were cruel if they didn't go along with it. So if you start with that belief, the rest of it makes sense. The trouble is the belief is a lie.
Yeah.
But they do believe it.
Yeah. And also why I'm so concerned about this is because I have two kids myself. I had two daughters. One is soon to be 2 years old and the other is 8 years old. And I'm also concerned about this because what world will they be growing up in? And what kind of stuff will they be learning at school? Because I had a guest on recently where we went through all the school books that they're reading in kindergarten and school and later on, and we're picking out all these sentences where they're talking about you can be whatever gender you want to be, and I think that's horrible because a kid shouldn't read that, because it would do more harm than good, because it will confuse them, and I don't think it's a good idea to have that. And also with this social contagion aspect of it, because let's say you have a kid who doesn't have a good core family, who doesn't have a father or mother that's there for them, and they have these mental issues, and then they find this stuff on TikTok or Instagram, and then they see, perhaps that is the peg that I can put this on, perhaps that is the hook, perhaps that is something that is what's wrong with me, I'm in the wrong gender. And then they go, and then they have this social contagion that is what they end up concluding that is wrong with them, that has nothing to do with it, like in fact. And then we have to somebody has to be the grown up in the room, I feel. Somebody
and grown-ups
has to
aren't doing
say
that.
and enough,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something else, is the mental healthization of everything,
Yeah.
Like, I think I would probably 5 or 10 years ago have thought it was good that we talked much more about mental health, and that we understood that people could be struggling, and you might be working with people who are depressed or who are anxious, and we should be supportive and so on. And of course I still think that. But what never occurred to me at the time is that talking all the time about mental health is actually very bad for people's mental health. And if you have poor mental health, and many of us will at some point, and it's important to recognize that it doesn't make you a broken person or a bad person, and you may need help. But the help that you need is a professional. And one of the things the professional will do, if they're good, is they'll work out how to improve your cognition habits so that you don't ruminate, for example. Like, you don't get yourself into horrible loops of just thinking I'm a terrible person or whatever. Like, they're trying to teach you coping skills. And it may be that you have to try a few different therapists so that they have to change their methods a few times in order to get it right. And instead, we've had this idea that, like, the more mental health treatment we can have, the better. and teachers and everybody who works with young people has been given very short, usually very poorly designed courses, often just a half day or something, on mental health. And the result is that in many schools, and certainly in the UK, I mean, my children, like my younger boy is just finishing school this year, and that I have a lot of siblings, and I'm the eldest. So I've got an awful lot of nieces and nephews going through school at the moment. The things they're doing, it's as if they set out to make happy children unwell. So it's things like one of my nieces was sent home and told that she had to set the alarm on her phone. I think it was for every half hour. And she was to write down what her mood was on a scale of 1 to 10 every time her alarm beeped. And I mean, she is this beautiful child. Like you couldn't, she's as happy as the day is long. She's the most talented, gorgeous, clever, charming, good, successful child. Like she wakes up every day with a smile and she just is a brilliant kid. And at the end of the day, she said to her mum, I'm not feeling great. She said, because I can't just keep writing 10. So I'm trying to think like, what's not good? Like this is the worst thing that they could do to her is to teach her this. And my son, the 17-year-old, last year, they had to all wear orange on Mental Health Day. Don't ask me why. Orange is Mental Health Day color or something. And they were going to be doing a whole load of seminars and things. And I said to him, try not to listen. Like, just try to sing to yourself in your mind and not listen, because he's a very cheerful kid and, he's doing great. Like, don't let these people talk you into wondering what's wrong with you. Like, you can try this experiment yourself if you're feeling pretty good. If you think of your abdomen, because your abdomen's the bit that you can persuade yourself about most, if you think hard about it for a few minutes, it'll start to hurt. You'll start to notice that there's little tweaks and twinges. It's like being a hypochondriac. Like, it's really a good idea not to think about these things. Go along and do whatever medical tests your country recommends, but don't think about them beforehand. Don't think about them while you're waiting for the results. And yet that's what they're teaching children to do. So we're creating mental distress, and we're creating it about gender in particular, but about other things as well.
I remember Jordan saying on the podcast with you is that there's no difference between thinking about yourself all the time and being miserable. It's like the same thing.
That's so true. So I mean, I've always, my parents are fantastic people, and I think they taught myself and my brothers and sisters a lot of important life lessons. But the old-fashioned things like like if I ever said to my mother I was bored, she'd say, "Well, I can give you something to do." And I'd run off and find something else rather than clean the kitchen or whatever it was she was thinking of. Or if you're feeling sad, like, depending on where you are and what's going on in your life, like either just do one of the harmless things like have a nice bath and read a book, or just say to yourself, God, I'm probably just tired. I'll go to bed and I'll feel better tomorrow. Or ideally, think, what can I do for somebody else? Like, get yourself outside yourself. And we all know, we used to know those things, but my children have never been told those things in school. Never, ever, ever. Nobody has ever said, some rain falls into every life. Okay, you feel bad now. You won't tomorrow. This is a minor problem. You're basically fine. That's just, they make a big thing of everything. They encourage the children into mental distress. Something I did want to say in response to all the things you said about schools, which I think is really important. It is true that all of this hits the children who are most vulnerable the worst. So not just the gender stuff, but all the other creation of mental distress hits the kids who are already sad, who are abused, who don't have loving parents, who have mental conditions like ADHD or autism. It hits them worst. But it's like any contagious disease. It spreads out into the general community. Like, if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, like everybody who got COVID was somebody who was immunosuppressed or, had breathing difficulties or whatever. And then totally healthy people got it. So, I'm hearing all the time about, friends and family and people who write to me saying about their children. And these are wonderful families, people in very happy marriages with great kids who are doing fantastically well. And those kids now say, I'm non-binary, I'm trans. And then you've got this brilliant kid who's thrown the whole family into total anarchy and distress and can come out of it a very bruised and damaged person as a result.
I'm left thinking that what do these kids need parents for after the fact, because the parents aren't doing their job. It's like these kids are all alone.
But you can try and do your job. I know parents who are doing their job, but you can't parent brilliant. Of course, you can parent as well as you possibly can, and your child will have a better chance in every way if you do. But when the culture is so set against you, I mean, imagine we had a culture that was trying to push cigarettes on every child at every opportunity they could. And they're telling them lies about how cigarettes are good for you, and they're giving them free cigarettes, and they're giving them social status if they smoke cigarettes. You can be the best parent in the world, but your child is still quite likely to smoke. So you're doing everything you can, but the fact is the culture is working against you. I mean, I think you have to do everything that you can, because we can't just pickle our children and leave them, to wait for us for 10 years while we sort this out. So there are things that you can do, but we've actually got to try to fix the culture as well.
Yeah, because I think the culture and the medical profession and parents need to be aligned. It's like the analogy. I think you have it in your book as well. Is like when a kid goes to the doctor's office, and perhaps she's having trouble with anorexia and eating disorders. It's not like the doctor would say, "Yeah, you are a bit too fat." Yeah. I totally agree with your view of yourself that you are too fat. You need to be more skinny. Nobody says that. Instead, they give them the truth, and they try to treat them with respect and care, and in accordance with the medical profession. It's like I think that's a good analogy to what's going on with when the doctors say, "Yeah, we trust you when you say you're in the wrong gender."
And worse than that, the way that they behave to everyone around them. I mean, there's two anecdotes that I think are interesting here. I was talking to another writer I know, and she told me that her husband was a retired psychiatric nurse. So he'd worked in inpatient facilities with people with very severe mental illness. And he said, when you're training in that job, there's something they teach you, which is never, ever, even once, validate the delusion. And he said, if you do that, and the expression, it just stuck in my mind, you will lose control of the ward. So what he's imagining is a situation like, it may be that you're understaffed that day, somebody's ill, things are kicking off, people are really behaving badly, like it's all very stressful, and somebody says, I'm Napoleon, and they're playing up to you, Like the temptation must be very strong to say, yeah, all right, you're Napoleon, now sit down. But you must never do that, because if you do that once, this person will be harder to deal with next time. And I think that's what we've done. We've validated the delusion, and now we have lost control of the ward. And then the other thing that came up recently for me, I was talking to a man who has a son who's about 30, who has had a very difficult time since his teens, and, really went off the rails, and, serious drugs and so on, and is now somewhat better, but not fully better. And we were talking about gender things, and I said, now imagine that when your son started on this path, the doctor said that what he was doing was right, and they told you that you had to support him in his drug taking, and if you refused to do so, they threatened you with social services and said that you were a bigot, and that you might lose your job if you talked about this. And your pastor or your religious leader said that you were a bad person, and that you'd be cast out of your church. And your own relatives and friends said that you were as bad as a Nazi. That is what it is like for these parents of these kids. They know that what their children are doing is potentially life-destroying, and is definitely not what the kid needs, and it's not helping them. I mean, I have heard so many times people saying, they said my child would feel better if we did this, but my child is falling apart. I've never heard anyone say, wow, that really sorted out everything. Yeah, I mean, it may sort it out for a while. The child is euphoric for a while, but I mean, they're living a lie, and the world doesn't go along with them, and it makes them very fragile doing that. But you've got to go along. Oh, completely.
Yeah, they're threatening the parents with saying, would you rather have a dead child or a happy trans child?
Exactly. A dead daughter or a live son. It's the most wicked thing they do. And they've no evidence that it will stop the suicide, but suicide is the worst outcome. I actually think they're coaching the children to commit suicide. Like, suicide is very, very contagious as an idea. So they say, I've heard parents say that doctors in front of the child said, you must transition your child or your child will be very high suicide risk. Like, how can the parent then say, I don't think this is a good idea? The child has literally just heard that means they're a high suicide risk. It's totally unethical. So these parents, they go absolutely mad. God bless them. They're the people I'm so sorry for most of all. They are gaslit beyond anything I've ever seen in society before, because not only is a terrible thing being done, but they're being told they must go along with it on pain of incredible level of sanctions.
And also even worse in those countries like Canada, where the parents don't even have any say in the matter. Like if
Yeah, you
they
might not
oppose
even
it,
find
no.
out.
Yeah, and you lose custody of your kids or something
Oh, I've
because
heard about this happening here. I mean, this happens in the UK too. Not so much the custody. It hasn't got, I mean, I know people who have been threatened with it. And in particular, in a divorce, the parent who's willing to go along with it is much more likely to keep the kid. But more the transing behind the back. I know loads of people by now whose child was transed at school behind their back. And things, mad things like the whole school being brought together and everybody told, you know, this trans child, let's say it's a girl called Josephine who now calls herself Joseph. You know, Joseph's parents are bigots, and Joseph will be in grave danger if anyone doesn't remember to call Joseph Josephine, she, her, in front of his parents. So remember that Joseph is he, him at school, but if you see the parents, do not let on. Like children literally told this in school.
so crazy. While we're on the subject of school, what do you think about all the gender ideology in the school books and the curriculum that the kids have to learn?
And it's all got to go. It's all got to go. I mean, they're being coached in a disgusting cultish neo-religion under the guise of civil rights. It's indoctrination. We've got to stop it as parents. You know, and I know that's difficult, but schools is in some ways easier than other institutions because in most places, at least, the school can't kick your kid out for you being a massive nuisance of a parent. So they may, you know, I mean, you see this in America, like in America, in the states where the Democrats are in power, like they've gone completely overboard on all this stuff. But you see parents starting to form groups and go along to school board meetings and then try to get sensible parents elected to the school board and so on. I mean, that is the most effective grassroots movement. And that is the thing. When I say change society, that is the thing that parents need to do most of all, is interact with their child's school. And just keep saying, I want to see what you're teaching them, and going up and saying, but how can you tell them that sex is a spectrum? You know that's false. Is that what they're learning in the biology class? Then why are you telling them it in the sex ed class? And just keep saying this and be ready for your child to be told this nonsense and tell them beforehand it's nonsense. Like imagine that you are somebody from a minority religion who has to send your child to a really intolerant, like Saudi Arabia level of intolerant, indoctrinating school in the state religion, and think what you would do there if you were in Saudi Arabia and you wanted your child to understand that what they were being taught was all nonsense and wrong. You have to preload them with, you will be told this, it's false. This is why I think it's false. Be ready for it, child. And you still won't be necessarily safe.
I think the teachers have a responsibility. That I had this elementary school teacher here on my podcast. We were talking about all this ideology that they're teaching, and she's opposing it and doesn't like it at all. And she says that the teacher also has a right, but also a responsibility to consider what you're teaching to the kids. And in Norway, we have this thing called a right to a reservation, because if you know that what you're teaching goes against your convictions and what you believe to be true, you don't have to teach it. So you can reserve yourself from teaching it, and also by talking to the principal or the headmaster about what it is that the government is saying that you're teaching. Like you have this kind of autonomy there. It's not like you have to, like a robot, teach everything that the government from top down says that you have to teach. You can also have a little bit of room and flexible joints where you use your intellect to think about these things. And an analogy I think is like if you're a soldier in a war, you can't just hide behind, those were just orders. I'm just doing my orders. You can't do that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it does depress me how little people are willing to stand up to these things. And I mean, I do understand a lot of it. Most people have a lot going on in their lives. They're thinking about ill parents, or, a child who's unhappy, or a marriage that's in difficulty, or, there's not enough money or whatever. Like everybody has their own lives. And this is, it's so stupid as well. Like you can't help think like I shouldn't have to put this much effort in on something so stupid. And then you're scared as well. Like, I mean, it's a fact that in the lead up to the Second World War, like before it was clear what the Nazis were, like the genocide was on the cards. Before that, the way that they got themselves embedded and the way that kids joined Hitler Youth was their families knew that jobs were at risk if they didn't go along with it. And so, before you really were aware of how bad it was going to get, as you're sleepwalking and marching towards disaster, the fact is you're keeping yourself quiet because you know that your job, might be at risk here, and you might not be able to pay to put bread on the table, you might not be able to pay the mortgage. I think it's very like that. I think a lot of teachers are scared, and they're not wrong to be scared because people do lose their jobs over this. But you have to think, like, what is it that you're willing to go along with? How bad does this have to get before you would say enough? Because people have this illusion. They think, like, it's not so bad. It's not so bad yet. I can go along with this with my fingers crossed behind my back. I can say this stuff thinking, like, I don't actually have any trans kids in my classroom. I don't have any kids who've caught this contagion. But that's what the Germans did. Before it got really bad, they thought, like, I'll stop when it gets really bad. But the thing is, when it gets really bad, you've already done a whole load of going along. Like, how are you now going to say, after a long time of going along with things that were not okay, now it's too far for me? I would ask people to do that. If they're teaching this sort of thing, if they're working in an environment where they really are uncomfortable because they know they're lying to children in ways that are harmful, or indeed to adults, what's your stopping point? When would you say enough is enough? And pick a stopping point and write it down and put it up by the mirror. And then when that happens, the reason you've kept quiet up till now because you said it wasn't bad enough. Now it's bad enough.
What do you think about these drag shows that they have, like in kindergarten, or drag show story hour, and all these kinds of things where they're inviting drag artists to dance like
Yeah.
erotic sexual dances in front of the
I
children?
mean, drag isn't always that erotic, I mean, I don't like it, and I don't like it at all, and I think it's totally inappropriate. And it's one of the things that I need a little bit of time to say why. So young people who argue with me, which doesn't happen very often because mostly they don't argue, they just stand outside and scream about you. But when they do argue, they say, look, don't you say that you're against gender norms? Shouldn't you be actively glad that men are wearing dresses and makeup and so on? And there's an element of truth to that. Like, I don't think this turns gay men into women when they dress up like that to perform. I also don't think it's appropriate for kids. Like, I just wonder how naive you have to be to think that if your starting point was, like, suppose your starting point was, I want to talk to toddlers and little kids in kindergarten and kids in primary school, and I want to make sure that every one of those kids understands that you can be whatever you like in the way of clothes and behavior. It doesn't matter whether you're a boy or a girl, you can wear what you like, you can act how you like. And I also want to make sure that before children ever learn any prejudices on the basis of sexual orientation, they're totally comfortable with the fact that there are gay people as well as straight people. Like, that would be a good, specification for a program. Would you end up getting drag queens to come in and read to the kids if that was your specification? I mean, no, not at all. Like, for a start, loads of gay men aren't drag queens. Secondly, where the hell are the lesbians? Like, it's not diversity if you've just got drag queens coming in. So it obviously isn't that. It isn't about teaching children that they can be whatever they like, because that would be much more low key. That would be about getting, a female firefighter or, a man who is a pastry chef or something to come in. Like, people who are just doing things that are unusual for their sex, they'd be coming in and reading, and they'd be reading like Thomas the Tank Engine. But if you look at the books that they're reading, these drag queens come in, it's always gender identity books. So what you've got is a man who's dressed up as a very over-the-top parody of a woman. And he's reading a book about how everybody is a man or a woman or non-binary according to what they say. So as far as I'm concerned, what this is about teaching children, very little children, to call men women and she, her, and miss, and a woman's name when it's clearly a man dolled up in some crazy women's outfit, before they even learn what it is to be a man or a woman, because little children don't know. They think it's about the clothes and the hair. Yeah, so it's totally about gender identity. It's totally about gender ideology. It's indoctrination.
What do you think about that term, gender identity? Is there some value to it? Is it
No.
all
No?
No. What is it?
It just means soul. We have no mention of souls in laws or policies, none at all. Religions can do that if they want. They can talk about souls in church, but there's nowhere in law that we use the phrase soul, and there are no public policies that are based on souls. And gender identity is the same. It has no place in any law or policy or rule in any public place, only in a sort of a church of gender. And they can set them up if they want, as long as they don't go mutilating children.
What do you think about all these new pronoun usage where people like in their handle say I'm they them or he she, or do you think that that has any place in the law system where you have like this which Jordan Peterson was so opposed to this compelled speech where
wasn't he farsighted? I remember when he started saying that stuff, like 2015, 2016. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember thinking he was exaggerating.
Yeah, me too. Like C16 bill, like, could it be so bad? But yeah, he was right. It's like already right, then he could see what was coming, because when the law steps in, when the state steps in and dictates what you can say and what you can't say, and that you have to use, that is unprecedented, because you have these limitations of the free speech where it says what you can't say, which we've never had in the Western society, what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's not really about laws, at least here it's not. I mean, I think Ireland certainly is heading towards the point where if a trans person says to you, my pronouns are she, her, or they, them, or zuzir, and you refuse to use them, that could count as hate and you could be prosecuted. That's not the case here in the UK. What you're seeing, though, is employers expecting it. And I think that's very dangerous for employers, because here in the UK, at least, it is basically understood that this is a belief system. And so what you're doing is you're mandating a signal of adherence to a belief. And that's not acceptable in law at all. If I were an employer, I would say that you're not allowed to put these in your pronouns. And I know that sounds like a restriction on speech. And so I'm not pro restrictions on speech in general in private life. But in employment, there's lots of restrictions on speech. You present a professional attitude. There may be some words you must use when you answer the phone as a receptionist, or if you're a waiter or a waitress, you're going to have to say, sir or madam, and, may I bring you to the seat? And you're not allowed to talk about how rubbish the food is or anything like that, So employers do have a lot of control over your speech. And I think it's very unwise for employers to allow individuals in the workplace to do more than basic signaling of belief. Like, if you wouldn't be happy to have your employees put Allah is great or Jesus rose for your sins in their email signatures, then you shouldn't be happy for them to put he, him, because they're very much the same. They function the same way.
Yeah. Also, I just want to say that if you're one of those who dare to step out and have a free thought and criticize this whole trans ideology, then one thing that you often hear is that you're contributing to the mass murder of trans people, and that you're contributing to the murder of them. And one thing why I'm bringing that up, because I recently saw Matt Walsh, who is a journalist at the Daily Wire, who is also the one who produced the movie What Is a Woman. He was giving a speech at, I think, Stanford University, where he was going through all of these things, and he said, let's shed some light and some facts about these kinds of assertions. And he said that actually the data shows that in 2021, in the whole of US, only two trans people were murdered by some kind of reason where there was hate involved against trans people. Actually, there were more trans people killing Christians who were demonstrating against the trans ideology than trans people themselves being killed. So I just wanted to say that, because it's so important to address all of these kinds of assertions that make people scared to talk about this subject, and being afraid that they will be, stamped and they will be branded as contributing to hate and violence and the murder of trans people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the figures, but I know that people have looked at them. I'm sure Matt Walsh didn't come up with those figures himself. I'm sure that somebody else did that research and he's citing it. I think the claims of trans murder and even trans genocide are very interesting to consider. Like, I'm often called genocidal for saying that I don't think that there are any trans people, or that we should accommodate anybody as a member of the opposite sex. I, of course, don't think that you should be killing those people. It's like I would like there to be no anorexics, and my method for that is not killing all anorexic people. I mean, obviously, this is so stupid. But why are they saying death, murder, suicide, genocide? I mean, one reason, obviously, is that what they want from the rest of us is so outrageous that they have to put something very big on the other side of the scales. But also, this movement is narcissistic at its core. You know, it's incredibly self-centered. It's incredibly fragile. Narcissistic people are super fragile. They require everybody else to act along with their delusions the whole time, and to big them up and think they're the best and the most important and the most perfect. So, you know, you've just got some ordinary looking man, and he dresses himself up as a woman, and he puts on makeup, and he doesn't look great. Like, he really doesn't look great. But if you just say something like, you know, where would you like, I don't think you're a woman, which is a very neutral statement, that feels like ego death to this narcissistic person. And it's experienced as, like, it's really experienced as the most grotesque hatred. And they even feel like, you know, you're striking at their core, you are killing something in them. And so they react, sometimes with physical violence, but certainly very verbally, extremely. And so that's why they say genocide. Like, all, you know, if you just say, I don't think that trans people change sex, I recognize that trans women are men, that's experienced as the worst form of violence by somebody fragile and narcissistic.
Sensible people, when they hear that, you know, they don't want to be branded that way. They don't want to step out of line. They don't want to speak their opinions.
But you have to
that is the
remember what I said
pushback.
about the
Yeah.
psych ward. You know, don't validate the delusion or you will lose control of the ward. The first time that somebody said to one of these men, okay, I'll call you a woman, that was the original mistake. We should never have done it. Like, and now we're going to have to row back and say to these men who have been validated in their delusions, sorry, we've now realized that validating your delusion meant that we've lost control of the ward. We need control of the ward. You're going to have to go back to not forcing other people to go along with your delusions. And this really is going to be a miserable business. And, you know, I didn't cause the original problem. I'm not the person who foolishly agreed to let men present themselves as women and be called women and then, you know, write that into laws. But I'm the person who's now having to say, doing that destroyed everybody else's rights, in particular women's rights. It's destroying children's lives because it's teaching children lies about themselves. We are going to stop doing it. And these narcissists are going to scream blue murder.
Because we're living in an age of really, we're focused on self-realization, and the whole identity thing is really big. I think we can round it off on this point, because we're going for 2 hours now. But perhaps as a last point, what we're talking about is like identity. What is identity? I think everybody's confused about what identity is, and the whole notion that now you can just choose your own identity. Like, tomorrow I want to be identified as a fish. Like, everybody speak to me as a fish. Or you saw an example of the other day, like in Berlin, 100 people were gathered who identified as dogs, who were walking around, and everybody had to respect that and give them like dog food or whatever. It's like, what is that? What is identity at all?
I mean, I think there's a load of identities that matter a lot to people. Like, as we grow up, we kind of solidify into a certain sort of person. I can barely remember it now, but, you know, when you're little, everything seems possible. And you don't know, you know, what are you going to be? Are you going to be like a firefighter or an astronaut or a teacher or whatever, you know? And then as you get older, you kind of firm up in the person that you are. And that may involve identity type things like, you know, you may become a very committed Christian who spends your social life, your weekends doing good works through your church or whatever. And, you know, there's a source of enormous comfort and strength to you, and super important to your self-image and your image in the world. And for some people, their nationality is very important. I mean, I quite like being Irish, and I always tell people who think I'm British, no, I'm Irish. I mean, I think I don't notice my race much, because you don't tend to when you're white in a majority white country, but I noticed it a lot more in Brazil. because when I lived there as a foreign correspondent, because it's so mixed race. And again, I was living in a very white city. São Paulo is a very white city. But whenever I traveled, like I met people who had never seen a white person before. When I was traveling in the northeast of Brazil, a woman came up to me and she started touching my face. And the guy who was with me said, have you ever seen a white person? Or like, how many white people have you seen? And she said, realmente é minha primeira vez. In truth, it's my first time. And so I noticed being white, and I thought about being white much more. So I'm not somebody who thinks that there's nothing to the idea of identity. And your identities play out in the world and other people react to you in part because of your identity. It's the and everybody else had to feed them dog food bit of it that I object to. Like, I have some friends and colleagues who are Christian, who are, quite sincere Christians and who talk to me about their Christian belief and so on. And I like that because I like to hear why they think they're what they think. And I like to get ideas from lots of different places. But the moment that they said to me, and I'm going to lay my hands on you and pray and, bring you back to the faith of your childhood, I'm out. I am out. So I think that the problem is when identity is taken as a right to impose upon other people, either to force them to validate the identity or, and this is a word that you said earlier and we never followed up on it, which is victimhood. So specifically the identities that are linked to being oppressed or being lower on the victim status. Like we live in a culture now where to be a victim is inherently seen as a good thing, as opposed to a neutral thing. And so people who adopt victimhood identities are making a moral claim on everybody else. And that's the moral claim bit is the bit that I object to.
It's like intersectionality, that whole thing where how much of a victim can you be, and the moral victim you are, the more respected you are.
Yeah, and I mean, it didn't start out like that. Intersectionality started out as a perfectly reasonable observation that you could be oppressed in more than one way. And this word oppression has, it's become overused, but my God, there was oppression. There still is oppression. I mean, my God, there are Yazidi slaves. There are Nepalese people working themselves to death in the Gulf. There are oppressed people, and there are people who are oppressed in more than one way. There are Black women who had a particular experience under Jim Crow laws. And that was the idea that you would think about, intersectionality was good at first, like thinking if you were the feminist movement, so you're meant to be advocating for half of humanity, the female half, like, remember, they're not all white. Remember, they're not all Christian. Like, actually just do a bit of a thought process before you start going through your policies and think like, am I imagining that every woman is a middle-class white woman? Straight middle-class white woman? Or am I remembering that some women are lesbians and some are Black and some are single mothers and I have to think about the policies for them too? That was a good idea. But then when you start to tot up the points and think that nobody can speak about any of this unless they have all the identity labels, and that it's actually better to be oppressed, like whatever's praised morally, people identify into it. So it's not a great idea to praise being a victim. Like, I don't mean you should diss people who are victims. I just mean don't praise it. So yeah, we've taken some very bad wrong turns on all of this. There were some good ideas there that have been completely turned on their heads and turned into a disaster.
The idea that identity is purely subjective, like you could just choose that yourself. I think it's important to think about what the word identity, the first part of it, is also an identifier for other people to see, from their perspective, who you are. It's like it's not all about you. Is like,
oh my
I
God,
think
that's my favorite sentence. It's not about you.
Yeah, I think it's like an analogy to it is I can't decide like the following, like from today on I will have a good reputation. Yeah. Everybody must now respect that my reputation is good because I decide so. You can't do that because you can work for it. You can try to affect it. You can try to build a good reputation because you want your identity to be a person with a good reputation. But you can't demand it. You can't ask for it and then have some kind of legal ramifications for everybody who doesn't consent to your reputation being good.
Yeah, I think I say in the introduction to the book that gender self-ID or self-identification is a misnomer. It's a demand that other people identify you as the sex that you're not. And once you put it that way, you realize it's just not something that's in your power. Like, it's not in my power to tell people whether to see me as a man or a woman. I mean, the fact is I am a woman and I'm a fairly typical one. So anyone who sees me will see that I'm a woman. But I'm not making them do that. I just am that, and that's what they see. And it's out of my power, like you say.
Yeah, it's also I get thoughts of this. My freedom ends where your freedom starts, and that has to do with also language and how we see things. And you're allowed to see things the way you see them and express them the way you think of them.
And if you can't
And
do that, you will be stupid. Like, one of the things that I notice here is people are so stupid on this topic. Like, even people whose instincts are good, like, people come up with these idiotic sort of catchphrases that are moments thought. Like, they'll say something like to you, like, "Oh, your bathroom at home is gender neutral." Like, yes, that's true, but people don't walk in off the street to use the bathroom at home. Like, and people have been saying that on Twitter since I started looking at this subject. So I've seen people over 6 years say that. And the only way that things that stupid last is because people aren't thinking freely and having other people say things back to them. Because individuals are stupid on their own. We all are. We all need the hive mind to make us clever. So that's part of the reason for free speech, is to make us smarter.
yes. Also, Helen, what's your plan going forward from this? Are you working on like a new book, or what's your projects coming up forward?
Okay, so I work part-time for Sex Matters. So anyone who wants to know more about that, the website is sex-matters.org. We're very UK focused because it's a lot about the law, and laws are specific. But I mean, the underpinning laws basically go back to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and then via the European Convention on Human Rights. So they're things that are very applicable worldwide, whatever your individual laws are. I think there's good stuff there for people from everywhere. I have a subscription newsletter, which is thehelenjoyce.com. I do need to write a second book. I've had ideas. My poor old agent and my editor at my publishers every now and then say, "Helen, please, what are you going to write next?" I'm just very busy. I'm busy because this wretched subject has continued being very absorbing. And with Sex Matters, we're doing a lot of policy work and a lot of trying to influence the way that various important legal discussions are going. So yeah, I do have some ideas, but I'm not ready to share them yet.
But are you going around the country and internationally giving speeches and keynotes and those kinds of things?
No, my God, I wish.
No.
No, I mean, it's not possible to have written a book that did as well as this book that has had less attention in that sense.
That's so strange.
No, it's not strange. It's the way it is. I've never been invited to a book festival. I have, as I say, I've never been on the BBC to talk about this. So I talk to independent people like yourself. I talk to podcasters, including quite big ones. I was invited by a free speech advocate to speak at Cambridge University once, and the protests outside were so loud that I could barely be heard over them. I know. I mean, I was at an event a couple of weeks ago that Sex Matters ran at the People's History Museum in Manchester, which is where the suffragettes archive is. They've got all the original, these beautiful, beautiful banners that say, first in the fight, and votes for women and things. And I mean, we see ourselves very much as part of that fight. And yet the museum tried not to give us the booking, and, told the protesters outside that they were really sorry that they'd had to give us the booking because of the law. And I was followed down the street by people shouting, "Fuck Helen Joyce, my body, my choice," afterwards. And I had to put in a police report about it all. So, I'm glad that there is this possibility of doing non-mainstream journalism, and that some of it is very influential now, like big podcasts like Jordan especially. And then Twitter, very active on Twitter. And I write this column in the Critic. So, I can get my word out, but not through any of the old media.
I think that people will probably appreciate you coming to Norway and giving a speech or a keynote or something here, because I've been talking about to other people having you on the podcast, and they say, "Wow, that's so great. Oh my God, Helen Joyce." And it's like a lot of people have that kind of attitude towards you, that what you're doing is great, it's brave, and it's really important.
Well, you need to organize in Norway as well. Like, I get these quite irritating sometimes emails from people saying, "Oh, I can tell you everything about the horrific organization in Australia that's destroying all our rights. I've got a whole archive, and I've set this email up specially with an anonymous account to send it to you. Can you publicize this? Because I don't dare say anything. I'd lose my job." You're like, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't. I'm just one person, and I'm here." People have to step up themselves. If they think this is interesting, sure. I mean, invite me. I'll see if I can come. But you know what? Some Norwegians have to start saying this stuff. You can't be doing it on your own.
Yeah. But I'll talk to some people. I have a bit of a network after a while, and
well, let's
I
do
think
it.
that would
Let's
be
do a
great.
bit of misgendering. We're going to have to start, civil disobedience on this. I'm telling you, there's going to have to be civil disobedience.
Indeed, it will. But Helen, thank you so much for giving of your time and talking to me today. And it was really interesting and inspiring also to listen to you and listen to your thoughts and also your books. And I wish you really well in the future and all your projects.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you.